Hi, I'm Rachel from Maison de Pax, and today I want to show you how to paint wood trim. Painting wood trim is an excellent way to update your home. Fortunately, it's also a great DIY beginner job because it doesn't take any power tools or any special knowledge, just a little time and elbow grease. The most important thing with painting trim, though, is to do it properly. The last thing you want is paint peeling off of trim in the future. So I'm going to walk you through exactly how to do it, and I'm going to show you every step in the process. The first step, of course, is to prepare the trim properly. To prepare the wood, you'll want to get it cleaned really, really well. I like to use just an all-purpose cleaner and a terry cloth rag. I think the terry cloth gives me a little bit of texture to kind of scrub at it. Sometimes I'll just dampen it with water, but I like a simple all-purpose cleaner like this or simple green works really well. You're wanting to remove dirt and dust and oils. But before you even do that, it's important to look at the wood itself. Is it glossy? Now, this wood trim is totally matte. I'm not even sure if it was sealed. It may have just been stained. I didn't do this. This was done by the previous owners. But it's absolutely matte, and so I'm not worried about a glossiness. Glossy trim or glossy walls or glossy anything that you're trying to paint is not going to allow the paint to adhere as well. And so you want to get rid of any glossy sheen because that will allow your primer and your paint to stick really well. Now, as I said, this one is matte, so I just took the all-purpose cleaner and the rag to clean it. However, if you see a gloss on yours, then you're going to want to get rid of that glossy sheen. There are two ways you can do this. You could obviously take a sanding block and hand sand all of it until the glossiness goes away. Now, you're not trying to strip it completely. You don't need to remove the finish. You just want to rough it up so it doesn't have such a glossy sheen, because that won't let the primer stick. Or probably a better option, in my opinion, is a liquid deglosser. This is a chemical. You'll need to read all the precautions on the back: eye protection, hand protection, ventilation, etc. But it's a really simple job too. If you use a lint-free cloth, you can just put some on there and you can rub it on and let the chemicals do the work to degloss the trim for you. So both of those are great options. Either way, when you are finished deglossing or sanding, if you need to, then you want to clean it really well. So I would just spray a bit of this on and give it a nice scrubbing all the way down. Don't forget the sides as well, along the edges, because you're going to be painting that too. Then you'll be ready to prime. Now, for trim work, I like to use a 2-inch to 2.5-inch angled sash brush is usually what it's called. I actually have trim paint on mine right now, and so rather than wash that, I grabbed a similar one. You'll see the one that I really like when we do the trim paint in a second, but this has primer on it. You'll want to use either water-based or oil-based primer. It's really up to you. I have chosen to use a water-based primer, but make sure that you choose a primer that is made to be used with the type of trim paint you intend to use. We'll talk about trim paints in a minute, but be sure you choose a primer that will work with that trim paint. When you are, oh, I almost forgot. As always, before any painting project, be sure to prep. Give yourself a drop cloth or something to protect your floors. You may also choose to tape off the edges with painter's tape. I prefer to just use an angled brush really carefully along the edge, but you could absolutely put a strip of painter's tape all the way around in order to protect your walls a bit. Now, back to the primer. A small brush that will easily work with your angles, a little bit of primer on the end, and you can take it straight onto that wood trim. Now, you always want to take it in the direction of the trim if you can. That will help avoid drips, and that will give you a smoother look in the end, so in the direction of the wood. And you just want to go all the way around. Now, with all paint jobs, it is always better to do multiple thin coats than to do one really big thick coat. One really big thick coat is likely to leave you with drips and unevenness, and that's not what we want. Now, as you can see, it sometimes requires going back over the same spot a few times though. When I do that, I'm not trying to make the coat any thicker. I'm simply trying to make sure that I get full coverage. Okay, a whole coat of primer is on. I hope you can see in the video, it's not complete coverage by any means. There are places where the wood is showing through, and that's normal. Okay, that is okay for the first coat of primer, for the first coat that you put on. But I just wanted to point out that now is a great time. You have a couple of options. If your primer is not covering very well, if you are concerned that a lot of the wood is still showing through, then you may want a second coat of primer, because primer is cheaper than paint usually. And so if you're seeing a ton of places where the wood is still showing through, then you might consider a second coat of primer at this point. That's an option. Another option right now, which I find easier to do now than before, is to fill any nail holes. So on wood trim, they generally put the nails in, or excuse me, attach the trim with finishing nails and don't fill them, because with real wood, little bitty holes don't show up. But as soon as you paint the whole thing white, or whatever color you may want to paint it, then these little trim holes, whoops, that one's still damp. These little trim holes show up. And so when the primer is first on, I find that to be a really great time to fill. Now, I could not find my tiny little spatula thing, so I am using a plastic knife. But this is just a little bit of wood filler, and these are tiny little holes. We're not talking major repairs here. We're just talking filling the holes that you can see and that stand out and bother you. So you take a little bit of wood filler here. This side is dry. I started with this side. Take a little bit of wood filler here, fill it in right there. And this is usually easy enough that you can just smooth it out with your finger and you're covered. And that will take primer and paint in the same way that it would even if you put it on before the primer. So once your first layer of primer is on, go back with a little bit of wood filler, a little bit of caulk. Anything that's a seam between boards, you would want to fill with caulk, and anything that is more of a nail hole or even just a chip or a dent that is going to bother you, that you can see once you put that first coat of primer on, you'll want to fill that. Another way to decide whether or not you want 1 or 2 coats of primer is to test your trim paint on a little section and see how the coverage works. I have decided on this to actually go ahead with a second coat of primer. The wood trim is showing through a bit more than I would like. And as you can see, so much less of the wood is showing through. It's still not 100% coverage. That's what the paint's for. But this gives a more even color to go underneath the paint when you are ready to put your top coat on. Okay, I waited the full hour for the first coat of primer to dry. I put on a second coat and waited another hour. So now everything is dried according to the instructions on the can, and we are actually ready to paint. Don't forget, I also, between those 2 coats, filled the nail holes because they show up a whole lot better once you put the first coat of primer on. Really, the second coat of primer is optional. If you have tested your the coverage on your actual paint and you feel like 1 coat is enough, no problem. I just didn't love how much of the brown was still showing through after the first coat of primer, and I thought this would save me some coats of paint along the way. So here we go. Remember how I mentioned that my favorite kind of trim brush already had the paint on it? Well, this is the one. These little squatty brushes I just find really easy to maneuver when I'm trying to get around the cracks and along the lines. So this is my favorite kind. It's a 2-inch angled, they call it a sash brush usually. I think these are great for trim. So that's what we're going to use here. Now let's talk for a minute about trim paint. Some brands make actual trim paint. You can, like they might call it for trim and doors and stuff. That's usually great stuff. Oil base, if you are interested in using that, is also really great for trim. The thing you have to watch out with oil base is that you can't paint over it with latex later without a lot of preparation. And oil-based paint can be really smelly. They actually have some latex alkyds these days that are really strong. Anyway, you've got a lot of good options. What you don't want to use, generally speaking, is plain old flat wall paint, because that's not going to wear very well. The glossier the paint, the more wipeable it is. And so generally speaking, on trim, you're going to want something fairly wipeable and durable. You want to start with a minimum of satin glossed paint, or satin sheen, excuse me, is the right word, satin sheen paint. Eggshell or flat is going to not be able to be kept clean enough. For most trim projects, I use semi-gloss. I think that's your most common trim. But this room in particular, I really wanted the standout to be this brick. And so I'm actually going to go with a satin trim paint here, so I can just go tone on tone and match the paneling. So that's what we've got going, is a satin trim paint here with my little trim brush. And I want you to see the coverage that it gets after the 2 coats of primer. So as you can see, after the 2 coats of primer, I think 1 coat of trim paint may be enough, which will be great. Trim is just hard. It's hard to cover wood trim with a single coat of primer and paint. But it's important that we get good coverage, because the trim really calls attention to itself otherwise, and you don't want to see splotchy wood showing through. And that's pretty much it. You're going to keep going, paint in the same direction, just like we did with our primer. Try to avoid brush strokes with nice, smooth, long strokes in the direction of the trim, and then let it dry according to the package directions. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. For more DIY projects, decorating ideas, and design inspiration, subscribe or visit maisondepax.com.